Anybody care to guess what song that was inspired by?
No.
Wait, what song inspired that title? I should say. Sorry, I got my things mixed up.
Oh,
I don't know.
I have no
It's
idea.
an homage to Voodoo Child, Jimi Hendrix.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Yep. So let's go through the numbers here first. So Bitches Brew is number 39 in the 1970s, number 6 in the year 1970, and number 156 of all time. And on Rolling Stone's list, it cracked the top 100. It's number 87. So the album was actually recorded over 3 days, August 19th through the 21st, 1970, released on March 30th, 1970. It features the return of the producer Teo Macero, who was the producer for the previous album, In a Silent Way. That album was released in 1969, and Bitches Brew is really seen as an expansion upon the music that he did in a Silent Way, which was his first exploration into electronic, jazz, fusion, things like that. We did cover In a Silent Way in episode number 20, and we also covered a very different Miles Davis album, Sketches of Spain, in episode 14, both in season 1. So this is really a departure from the traditional jazz that Miles Davis had been doing for many, many years.
Is it?
And he really favors the more of a loose rock-based arrangement, pretty much all based on improvisation or on some structure, but mostly just improvisation. This did receive mixed responses when it first came out, but it eventually became Davis's highest charting album, which peaked at number 35, and it is the 8th best-selling jazz album of all time. In 1971, it won a Grammy for Best Large Jazz Ensemble Album, and it later gained recognition as one of jazz's greatest albums and was influential to rock musicians as well as jazz musicians.
I was going to ask, how many people played on this album, Matt? Because
Yeah,
as I'm listening to it, I'm like, God, there had to have been like 40 people on this album.
Well, he had, at the time, his core band was a quintet. So the core guys were Miles Davis on trumpet, Wayne Shorter on tenor sax, Dave Holland on bass, Chick Corea on electric piano, and Jack DeJohnette on drums. So those guys all played, but for the recording of this, there was upwards of 13 total musicians playing. So you had guys like John McLaughlin on guitar, Joe Zoenwall on keys, and that's absolutely right. There was multiple instruments. I'll get to that in just a second, but yes, there was a lot of people playing on this record.
Okay.
And there were only 8 on In a Silent Way. So even though these albums are lumped together as the beginning of the jazz fusion, it's the steps that he took to get from there to here is there's a lot, right? And one of them is just the amount of musicians that he was using. So just as a recap, we covered this a little bit in the In a Silent Way episode, but Davis really started getting into rock and other musical genres from his wife, Betty Mabry, who he married in 1968. And if you guys remember, she was 23 and he was 42. So he did one of those things. And he really
One of those things
where you marry somebody half your age. And Mabry was really kind of a person that was really much involved in the culture of rock and roll. Knew a lot of people, introduced Miles Davis to a variety of people, and he particularly became a big fan of people like the Byrds and Aretha Franklin and Jimi Hendrix, James Brown, Sly and the Family Stone. Bought a bunch of records and started feeling like he wanted to incorporate some of those sounds into his music.
See, Josh, even Miles Davis liked the Byrds.
He did. So Miles Davis comes into the studio with some ideas, some rough sketches of what he wants to do. Some of the music was written by some of the pieces were written by the musicians themselves, and this was just like it Davis described it as just all improvisational and, quote, not some prearranged shit. So he had no interest in like coming with any any ideas of what this exactly is going to be. And that's one of the main things that this album is known for is just the way that it was recorded. Essentially Davis would they would set up all the musicians around, and he would give very few few instructions, might have given something like a tempo count, maybe start off with a couple of chords, maybe he would give them a slight melody, suggestions as to what mood or tone that they might be going for, and then you just let them play. He gave them kind of carte blanche as to do what you want to do what you feel, and he felt like this forced the musicians to kind of pay close attention to one another, to themselves, and to Davis, who would make cues and change things up here and there. And apparently, I read this. I didn't hear it when I listened. I don't know if you guys did, but apparently on some of the quieter parts of the albums, you might be able to hear Davis's voice giving instructions to the musicians.
I heard it.
Did you hear? Okay, I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't quite get it, but
on Bitches Brew, I
Yep, I did too. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've got there's a variety of quotes. I read a long article about the very specifics of what was going on here, but a couple of them, one, Dave Holland who played bass, he said, "The recording of Bitches Brew was therefore often very fragmented. We'd have these sketches of ideas and we'd play each for 10 minutes or so, and then we'd sort of stop, come to an ending of sorts, and then we might do one more take like that, and then move on to the next thing. Often I didn't know whether we were rehearsing or recording, but Miles had a policy of recording everything." And that kind of brings me to the second part that this album is known for, and that's the production and the actual recording, which was done by the producer, Taylor Macero. He really, what you're hearing in this record is not just one. It's not like they just played, Pharaoh's Dance for 20 plus minutes. It's spliced together. It's like 15 different fragments of things that they were playing that were all interconnected together into the recording. So there's a lot of experimentation happening within the production studio as well. You're hearing a variety of different, splicing and echo, effects and things like that they're playing around with a lot. So that's the producer, even though Davis in later years would say in interviews that, the producer didn't really do a whole lot or didn't really give him a whole lot of credit. I think he only mentioned him a couple of times, like in his autobiography, that type of thing. But people really do give him a lot of credit for the production of this, because he really put all the pieces together. Davis didn't really do too much with that. So yes, John, so going back to the instrumentation, another thing that this record's known for is the rhythm sections. You would hear there were 2 different bass players, 2 to 3 drummers on a particular song, 2 to 3 electric piano players,
it's like the wall of sound of jazz.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, actually. You heard, and the solos were often Davis on trumpet or soprano sax, and another instrument that's very prominent on here is the bass clarinet. So another quote here that I thought was pretty good from an article I read, that Bitches Brew explores a new intangible musical universe, and any attempt to fully explain or define its concept and its music will inevitably diminish it to some degree. If one must find a label for the music, Lenny White probably had a good stab at it when he called it, quote, African-American classical music, a combination of the harmonic language developed in the West over several hundreds of years, played from an African-American perspective with an African-American approach to rhythm. This record is... It's very interesting. I'm interested to hear your takes on it. A couple of famous musicians had some takes. Tom York, singer of the English rock band Radiohead, cited it as an influence of their 1997 album OK Computer, saying it was building something up and watching it fall apart, and that's the beauty of it. It was at the core of what we were trying to do at the time. And then rock and jazz musician Donald Fagen from Steely Dan criticized the album as, quote, essentially just a big trash out for Miles. To me, it was just silly and out of tune and bad. I couldn't listen to it. It sounded like Davis was trying for a funk record and just picked the wrong guys. They didn't understand how to play funk. They weren't steady enough. So you've got a bunch of different takes on this. Later on, Davis did open up for rock acts, so he started playing larger crowds. He played a Fillmore East bill with Steve Miller and Neil Young and Crazy Horse on March 6th and 7th of 1970.
Could you imagine going to a Steve Miller concert and getting Miles Davis? All I can think of is that crusty sound effect, like when he goes,
Yeah, I don't think that's the same Venn diagram of fans for that. So,
although early Steve Miller was a little bit of a different thing, so yeah. Maybe.
I'm not terribly familiar with him, to be honest, but the stuff I do know I don't like. But anyway, so Davis, and this really, was a little bit polarizing. Jazz fans were not huge fans of it. Rock fans didn't really know what to make of it, but there was, it was, seen as very important and influential to musicians. A lot of musicians love this record, and even people that are in jazz. I think when Rolling Stone did their recent list, The Edge, voted this as one of his top 10 albums of all time.
Of course he did.
And you can't see U2 sounding like this at all. So
is Edge one of those guys that like his influences are all stuff that sounds nothing like his own music, which is always my pet peeve of like any musicians.
This is certainly one of them. Yeah.
We made this, but like here are my influences that sound nothing like it. So yeah.
And just one thing on the title before we get to our reactions, it's actually unclear. People aren't really sure where the title came from. Some might feel that it references the women who had become influential in Davis's life.
Are you talking about the betches here?
Yes. That's
okay.
I would not refer to them as that, John. Yes. But that's just me. But
yes, I didn't say I would. I'm just saying yes. So.
Others think that the bitches might refer to the musicians themselves, as it can sometimes be slang for someone that does something very well. So,
really, that's what they describe bitches as, someone who does something very well.
It's along the same lines as like motherfucker. Like that guy's a bad motherfucker. Like that's a bad bitch. Like they would say that about bitch, about the musicians. So I'm curious as to what you guys think. We'll start with you, Josh.
Well, I would not, if you were interested in listening to Miles Davis, I would not start with this album. That's for sure. It is an incredibly complex and dense record. I think it is a double album, so the first two tracks are, side A and B of one album, and they are 20 minutes and 26 minutes, I believe, something like that. And they seem far more experimental and pushing the jazz to its limits than the other four tracks on the other album. I feel like I enjoyed the back half more. The four tracks, they sounded more traditional in a way, quote unquote, and more easily listenable for sure than the first two tracks. I mean, the first two, Pharaoh's Dance and Bitches Brew, the self-titled track, they're all over the place. You get it's like free jazz on acid. It's like right to the extremes, I feel like, with the fusion elements as well. There are so many different instruments, like you said. I think there's a consistent theme of like twinkling electric pianos on that first track, and then trumpets come in, and then other instruments come in and out. At times it feels like they're all playing different things at different beats and tempos, and then sometimes they come together magically and cohere for a time, and then they deviate again. So it's like this almost like wave that ebbs and flows, and I found that on Pharaoh's Dance and Bitches Brew. I think I liked Bitches Brew a little bit more than the first track. You've got a lot of good bass lines and bass clarinet and finger snapping at the beginning that kind of laid it out for me, but then the trumpet is really front and center in a lot of the track. I heard that little background dialogue that Matt referenced around the 7:40 minute mark on that track. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine coming into, I was thinking about this, I was like, who in their right mind would play this album in some sort of like leisure party scenario? Because I want to be in that scenario where I walk in and hear this album being played. I'm just going to, like that Simpsons thing where
there were, like, this has to be like, there's got to be people that are like, oh man, there's nothing better at 12:30 when I come in and putting in Bitches Brew, and like I can guarantee there's people that say that,
Yeah, it's gonna be like Grandpa Simpson coming in the brothel, or he walks in, sees Bart, and then just walks right back out. That's me on this album. So, you think on Bitches Brew, you think it ends like 15 minutes in, but then it just keeps going, and and it kind of ebbs and flows on that front as well. There's periods of activity, and then it kind of slows the tempo, and think it kind of fades out or a little bit and comes back in. But in those first two tracks, I would not call it an enjoyable listen. It's challenging. I wouldn't say it's bad, because they're definitely going for something, but I would not. This wouldn't be an album that I would put on. like I said, Spanish Key and John McLaughlin, Miles Runs the Voodoo Down, and Sanctuary are the other 4 tracks, and they are much more coherent for me. I think there's more things that I could grab onto. I think I respond to music more that has like grooves and more steady tempos. I think I've said that before, and these definitely had that more. You've got more electric guitar that I noticed on Spanish Key, the trumpets throughout, and Miles Runs the Voodoo Down also has some kind of like, I think he's trying for funk elements there, but at least at the start.
Mm-hmm.
And then Sanctuary is very sad and more kind of downbeat and more trumpet as well. So yeah, I think I just respond to, I can only take the free jazz fusion so far. I think I respond more to traditional jazz, or at least more accessible isn't the right word, but things I can hear and keep the tempo with are things I like on this album more.
So I actually agree with you quite a bit, Josh. I like the back part of the album better.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, though, that I find free jazz more interesting than traditional jazz. Because even though more traditional jazz is more pleasing to my ear, maybe, it also can fall into the so pleasing for my ear that I just don't listen to it, pleasing to my ear. You know what I mean? Whereas this definitely kept my attention more. I think 3 things that I noticed really quickly were, number 1, Miles Davis plays the trumpet really loud and really high on this album, which is not something I did not hear him do in the other albums that we covered. And that like is immediately like jarring. And I know a lot of the big jazz musicians in the era sort of were always careful about how they put in their piece in the ensemble, you know, but here you very clearly knew when Miles Davis was playing. That would be my first thing. The second was, and I joked about it being like the wall of sound, but when Matt said the wall of sound, but, you know, like all these different people playing, unlike sort of that Spectre thing where he had everybody sort of playing the same notes, but just with different versions of the same instrument. Here, those instruments are there, but it sounds like they're all playing different parts. Mm-hmm. And so you hear like multiple pianos, multiple brass, multiple basses, drums all over the place. And I think especially on the first 2 songs, right? That's when you really notice stuff's going in a lot of different directions. It's kind of almost set up like a traditional rock band. There's a ton of bass, almost like a rock band bass that's in the front. Like we always talk about The Who, right? With the bass up front. Like there's parts that are similar to that on this. Like a funk band where the bass groove runs through it and you notice it immediately. That was why I asked Matt, like, how many like people are playing on this? Because it felt like there was so much bass. It can't just be from one person, or had to be like double tracked or something. And ditto with the piano at times. I'm like, what in God's name is being played like here? It felt like on Pharaoh's Dance there were like 46 different pianos going, and on like Miles Runs the Voodoo Down, it wouldn't surprise me if you told me like 6 people were playing the bass on that, or rhythm and bass, you know, at different times. So those things stand out, I think, off the bat there. And then I think the final thing that I kind of noticed about this was I listened to it multiple times, and unlike a lot of the jazz albums we've listened to before, it hit my ear easier because it has elements of the rock that we've listened to. So it was very familiar. Whereas jazz, I usually go in kind of like, all right, it's going to be different from my ear. I have to listen to it really closely. I didn't have to as much on this. That's not to say it's not complex. It's super complex. But what I noticed, I think, in future listens were that I was picking up some of the same stuff. Whereas when we've done jazz albums before, I noticed that every time I listen to it, I'm like, it's like peeling back layers from an onion. Whereas this one, I wasn't doing that as much because I think some of the sounds were more familiar to me. So I can definitely see why they say this one was more rock oriented, because it does sound like a rock album at times. It also is like and I like this album, but it does sound like the template for lots of head up my ass, you know, art project type rock, you know, that would come later. There are some bands that we'll talk about later where we'll disagree and stuff like that, you know, in terms of that type of music. But yes, I could see how many of those bands love this album, because at times it can deviate into the complicated for the sake of being complicated category. Yeah. So that's my takes.
Were either of you familiar with this before this week?
Nope.
No. I remember you had this on CD, right, Matt?
Mm-hmm.
I never listened to it, though.
Yeah, I've had this. I got this record, another one of the records
Matt,
I got.
As a fan of bands that sometimes have their head up their ass with pretentiousness, I'm going to guess that you probably like this album, right?
So I wouldn't. No, I don't love this album.
Wow. Okay.
No. This this is
you did.
No, I wouldn't say that I love it. No, I this album is as confusing for me to like talk about as almost any record that we've covered, I think. I've listened to it many times. I did listen to it several times this week. And my reactions to it really do fluctuate, and they have over the years. There's times where I'm listening to it and I'm just like overwhelmed with like, holy crap, what is going on here, right? Because it's just this record it's insane. Sherry had a good word for it too. She said it's intrusive, because like it's like all these noises just popping out, just unexpected things, like turns. There's no structure. It's like that again, that free form, jazz thing. So it's definitely in that realm.
Can I ask you a question real quick? I know you found the Eric Dolphy album to be intrusive, right?
Yeah.
That way. Did you find this to be more or the same? Because I actually found this to be more than even the Dolphy stuff, which I came to kind of understand a little bit more as we listened to it.
So again, that's a harder thing first of all, it's been a while since we listened to Dolphy, so my memory, I just remember my like, holy crap, like this is too much. But I have listened to this. I'm more familiar with this, so this week it's just continuation of the listening that I did before, so it wasn't as, just because I was more familiar with it. So I don't know if that's a fair assessment, because it's just based on my own like unique experience with both records.
Okay.
So there's times where I'm just like, it's, just what they're doing is insane. And the fact that they're just sitting there and just playing, you could definitely tell that, that they're kind of off doing their own thing. A lot of times it seems like nothing's matching up, right? This is just like people just, a bunch of paint just splattered and spilled all over the place. And this is the artwork that you're getting, right?
Yeah.
But on one hand, I do like that because it's so interesting. Right. And I'm just like, as I'm listening, I'm like, I certainly don't hate it, because I think there are elements, like there are bass grooves, there's piano grooves, there's little guitar parts, that are thrown in there that are like, oh, that's kind of cool. That's a little interesting thing that they do, but they don't do it terribly long. Then they go into something else, maybe some of the bass lines and stuff like that kind of continue for longer periods of time. But, but even within a longer song, it's not like they're keeping that same bass line throughout the entire song. So it does deviate a lot from what it's doing. And there's other times where I'm listening to this where it's just, it does just all blend into the background. It all blends, differentiating songs, one song from the next is not the easiest thing to do. I think I would agree with you guys that overall the second side is more of it's an easier listen. It's not an easy listen. It's an easier listen than the first half.
Try picking a 50-second clip for a montage on this album.
Josh, just do whatever. I liked Miles Runs the Voodoo Down, so just pick what you want. So yeah, exactly. So it totally makes sense that this is an album that musicians of all genres love and appreciate. That they're just like blown away. Because this is clearly Davis is on a different level, and a lot of times I don't understand that level, and so I am never going to be that person that's like, oh my god, I love this. This is not a record that I love. I love what other artists got from this and try to incorporate somewhat into their albums, like OK Computer. If they're trying to like throw in some unique aspects that were inspired by an album like this, that's why I love the fact that this album is out there, because it inspires other things that I am going to gravitate more towards. And I think that this record definitely does. Yes, it's definitely weird that someone like The Edge this is an album that I'm listening to. It's a top 10 album. This is The Edge. The road trip music is Bitches Brew, I guess, right? So, it's kind of mixed reactions for me, because I can't say that this is the type of thing that I'm listening to on the regular. Before this podcast and in between the years when I first got it, in college, it is something that I occasionally put on just to revisit, check it out, and just, try to see if I get something out of it. But I can't say that I've ever really listened to this record and walked away going, oh my God, I love this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I appreciate what they're doing. I really like offbeat stuff. I really like kind of just, things that are kind of going out there. But this is something that for me, I'll play once every, 2 years, if that, just to kind of go back to it. So it's a very, Josh, I think a lot of the words that you used to describe it, it's intense. It's very full. It is wall of soundish and it's certainly not for everybody. And I'm not sure if it's for me. I'm very confused.
Well, Davis just wants to. It seems like he wants to throw as much as possible or add as much as possible when composing these sessions. In comparison to somebody like John Coltrane, I think I responded to that more because at least there's only like 5 instruments, right? So it's a bit easier to put it together in your head. This is just like, if you have 2 pianos and 2 drums and 2 basses, that's like, that's too much for me, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Well, Coltrane's a lot more standard and tighter, and this is also years after Coltrane did stuff. I think what's the latest album we did from Coltrane? 65 or 66, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. Mm-hmm. So this is just pushing it to a level that I can't comprehend. At some point you have to take a step back and say, I just don't understand what's going on. Well,
yeah, and I think that's safe. And I struggle for the right words. It's, I don't hate it, right? It's certainly not on the level of that I felt with Eric Dolphy. And who knows, maybe something like Eric Dolphy, something if I listen to a lot, I would like, but I also, when I listen to that, I'm to the point where I'm like, I don't want to force myself to liking something. I kind of got there with this record because when I was in college, and that's Miles Davis was very attractive to me because that was like what we were talking about in the class, the history jazz class, where they were like, this is where rock and jazz meet. I'm like, well, I love rock and I like parts of jazz, so let's see where this goes, and so I was like, let me try to get this, and I never fully got it. I kind of get it, but like not really to the level that other people were, but so I because of that, I'm more familiar with this. But yeah, man, this is different. But it's one of his crowning achievements. It's also, John, I also think it's a good thing that you brought up like how his trumpet's playing, how loud it is, how high it is, because you're absolutely right. Miles Davis prior to this was known for subtlety.
Right, that's what I stood out.
Yeah, he was known for what he wasn't playing, and when he decided not to play is when he did play.
Well, and even on In a Silent Way, which was a year before this. Yep. Right, like it still wasn't up there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so he clearly went for something different. And, but this is kind of what he did later. He would go throughout the rest of his career, kind of in this realm. He would cover pop songs. He covered, Michael Jackson's Human Behavior and like Cyndi Lauper's True Colors. So he would, do stuff like that. He played with a lot of musicians.
Human Behavior or Human Nature?
Human Nature. That's Human Behavior is Bjork, right?
Bjork. Sorry. I was about to say,
yeah. Human Nature, and that, so he would do songs like that, and if you hear the stuff that he's doing in the '80s, he's got some. Miles Davis has his '80s period too. Like it's like it's like that question I think we might have talked about, like who escaped the '80s. I don't know. Maybe that's something we could talk about more, but but. I guess, the follow-up, because this is the last record that we're covering of Miles Davis on the bio. He, in early September of 1991, he checked into a hospital near his home in Santa Monica, California, for some routine tests, and the doctors suggested that he have a tracheal tube implanted to relieve his breathing after he had some repeated bouts of bronchial pneumonia. And I guess the suggestion provoked, this is what it said in Wikipedia, the suggestion provoked an outburst from Davis that led to an intracerebral hemorrhage followed by a coma. So he angered himself into a coma, essentially, because the doctor suggested he might want to get this tracheal tube. So he did spend several days on life support, but the machine was turned off and he died on September 28th, 1991. He was 65 years old, and the cause of death was attributed to combined effects of a stroke, pneumonia, and respiratory failure.
You know what I look forward to in terms of getting to the 90s, 00s, and 10? not having to give like obituaries for the vast majority of the people that we're covering.
Yeah.
It's quite a downer to like give these obituaries.
And like 65, like that's the thing. When you look back, and when I was doing research on him, and I'm like early stuff of like talking when he's in Juilliard and he's playing like in the 40s, and like World War II's going on, and he's on the streets of New York playing with like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker and stuff, and it's just like this guy's been around for forever, and he was only 65 when he died.
Well, and 65 is like Methuselah for jazz musicians, because I mean, God, everyone we've covered, like it feels like died young. I mean, Mingus, I think, died 50s, right, of ALS, and Dolphy died real young, right, because of complications from that surgery. I think Coltrane, he was not old when he passed away.
40 something, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus, it's like I mean, it's something else. So jazz in particular has
and certainly Miles Davis he got into drugs, heroin, alcohol, cocaine. Like he went hard on that stuff, and the fact that he didn't die, from an overdose is pretty amazing. In 2006, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which recognized him as one of the key figures in the history of jazz. Rolling Stone has described him as, quote, the most revered jazz trumpeter of all time, not to mention one of the most important musicians of the 20th century. And BestEverAlbums.com ranks him as the 16th greatest artist of all time.
Mm-hmm. He's definitely, I think of the big three that we covered, Davis, of 60s jazz musicians, Davis, Mingus, and Coltrane. I think his albums are my favorite. Although I loved In a Silent Way, I like this one, and I did not like Sketches of Spain. Yeah. Coltrane probably had more of a higher average, because he didn't have one I disliked as much as Sketches of Spain, but he also didn't have one I liked as much as In a Silent Way. So...
Well, we didn't even cover what, people is the greatest jazz, not just greatest Davis album of all time, but what everybody says is the greatest jazz and the best-selling jazz album of all time. It's like 4 million copies sold. And I think the next one was, the next highest jazz album was like 1 million. But that's Kinda Blue from 1959.
Right. 59.
So,
yep.
And that's like the top best ever albums. That's the number one album from the 50s. And so that, John, that's definitely more of a, if you've ever heard that, that's definitely more of that standard jazz
I
sound.
did listen. Yeah. I did listen to it back when we were doing Coltrane and stuff to kind of get context. And it's very much like the jazz of the early '60s. Very tight for jazz, as tight as jazz can be, because it's improvisational. So very totally different than this. Yeah,
it's the cool version of jazz. It's a quieter kind of like it's not upbeat at all. But if you're gonna go to Davis to start off, that's where you got to go with Kinda Blue, and just jazz in general. I think that's like one of the first albums you got to go to is Kinda Blue.
And I don't mean to go too hot take, but I actually think that I like this period of Miles Davis better than I like that, because it's more interesting. And sometimes my knock on jazz is that jazz can get boring for me. And when jazz gets more discordant, I guess, it may be an album it's like the opposite of CCR, right? It's like an album I don't want to listen to all the time, but it's interesting and intriguing. Whereas like CCR is an album I want to listen to all the time, but I don't know if it's intriguing,
So what circumstances, John, would you see yourself revisiting this? And if so, like what circumstances would those be?
I find myself revisiting the jazz albums that we've covered in bits and pieces every time we do jazz. It's part of the reason why I get ahead of us sometimes in terms of listening to stuff, so I can go back and listen to it, because I really feel like I need to check my jazz knowledge against what we've listened to before. So going into this, I listened to a little bit of Dolphy, I listened to a little bit of Coltrane, I listened to a little bit of Mingus, just to kind of get a feel for what we've covered before, to contextualize it. Yeah, but it's ironic because I did that, and then it was like I could have just listened to Hendrix and stuff, and that would have done just as much as the jazz did. So.
But I mean, I guess what I'm saying is like going forward, like podcast aside, like what could you see yourself just like listening to this, and if so, what circumstances would those be?
Doubtful, because jazz is not my go-to. And it's also, when we're doing albums for this, I think I've told you guys, when I'm not doing reviews for this podcast, I try to listen to modern music to keep me sharp. I was joking around the other day. It's like I listen to music from before I was born, and I listen to music now. And the only music I don't listen to is the music I grew up with and had in my teens and 20s right now. And in some ways that's good, because that's what I'm most familiar with. I mean, let's be honest. How much are we going to really have to do research for those episodes when we do it, maybe a little, but we're going to also be able to tell anecdotes and stuff. So,
Right.
So in that context, because there's so much stuff, do I think I'll go back and listen to jazz, which is not one of my defaults? I doubt it. But
Yeah.
I have enjoyed gaining greater knowledge of jazz and doing the research and being able to have comparative points.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, so thumbs up, down. Where do we land on this?
I'm kind of neutral on this album.
I say slight thumbs up for me.
Yeah, this is for the adventurous only. Like if you're adventurous and you like different stuff,
on my chart,
it's a big thumbs up. If you are not, big thumbs down. You're not gonna. If you're traditional, like you need rhythm and or you need like a structure, do not go here. You will